Clara Whitmore's hands were still black with funeral dirt when they came for the house. Not even a week, not even 7 days since she'd pressed her palm flat against her husband's coffin lid and told herself she would survive this. The door flew open before she reached it. 2 men in railroad coats stepped inside without knocking, without a word of warning, and began stacking her husband's belongings against the porch railing like they were clearing out a storage shed. "You've got 20 minutes, ma'am," the taller one said. "Company property. Daylight's burning. If you've ever felt like the world kept moving the moment your heart stopped, this story is for you." Please subscribe to our channel, hit that notification bell, and leave a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to Wyoming, 1891, and stay with Clara until the very end. The morning of December the 9th, 1891, was the kind of cold that didn't announce itself. It simply arrived, pressing through the walls of the little rented house on the edge of Haller Creek, like it had always belonged there, like warmth had only ever been a temporary guest. Clara had been awake since before dawn. She hadn't slept more than 2 hours at a stretch since the burial. And even those 2 hours weren't sleep so much as a kind of suspended grief, the body giving out before the mind would allow it. She was standing at the kitchen window, holding a cup of coffee she hadn't drunk, watching the pale gray light come up over the frozen creek when she heard boots on the porch steps. 2 sets. Heavy, unhurried. She set the cup down. The door opened before she could reach it. A man she'd seen once or twice in town, broad-shouldered with the flat, practiced expression of a man paid to deliver bad news, stepped across her threshold without so much as a knock. Behind him came a younger man, thinner, carrying a folded piece of paper and avoiding her eyes. "Mrs. Whitmore," the broad-shouldered one said. He didn't take his hat off. "I'm Mr. Doyle from the Central Wyoming Railroad Land Office. This here's my associate, Peters." "I know who you are," Clara said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "What are you doing in my home?" Doyle reached into his coat and produced a second folded document thicker than the one Peters held and held it out to her. "Property reverts to company ownership upon the death of the employed tenant. Section 4, Clause 9 of your husband's work contract. You were sent notice 3 weeks ago." Clara didn't take the paper. "My husband was buried 4 days ago." "Yes, ma'am. We waited as long as the calendar allowed." She stared at him. 4 days. "The company has been patient, Mrs. Whitmore. I want you to understand that. The standard grace period is 48 hours. You've had 4 days. Something moved through her. Then not anger, not yet something quieter and more dangerous. She looked past Doyle at young Peters, who was now studying the floorboards with great intensity, and she thought he knows. He knows exactly what this is. "My husband died in your company's mine shaft," she said. "The rope they used on that lift hadn't been replaced in 3 years. Everyone in Haller Creek knows it. My husband told Mr. Langford about it twice, and twice he was told to keep quiet, or find other employment." Doyle folded the document and tucked it back into his coat. "Mrs. Whitmore, the cause of your husband's death is a matter still under company review. I'm not here about that. I'm here about the property. You're here to put a widow in the snow. I'm here to execute a legal eviction." Same thing. He didn't blink. "You have until 10 o'clock. That's..." He pulled a watch from his vest pocket and glanced at it with the mild interest of a man checking the time before supper. 2 hours and 14 minutes. Take what belongs to you personally. Leave everything that came with the house. If you haven't vacated by 10, we'll be authorized to remove your belongings ourselves." He turned toward the door, then paused with his hand on the frame. "I am sorry for your loss, ma'am. I mean that sincerely." "No," Clara said quietly. "You don't." He left without answering. For a long moment, she stood exactly where she was, in the middle of the kitchen floor, in the house she had lived in for 6 years. In the house where she had cooked 6 years of meals and stitched 6 years of torn shirts and lain awake on 6 years of cold nights, waiting to hear her husband's boots on those same porch steps. The coffee cup sat on the counter, still steaming faintly. Then she started packing. She didn't cry. There wasn't time for it, and something deep in her chest had already decided that Doyle was not going to see her cry. She moved through the rooms with the mechanical focus of someone operating on instinct. Her clothes, her sewing kit, the small tin box where she kept the last $12.40 she owned in the world, the wooden box with Thomas's Bible, and the plain gold wedding ring she'd slipped off his finger in the undertaker's back room because she couldn't bear to leave it in the ground with him. She left the curtains she had sewn herself because they had been made from fabric Thomas bought at Hester's dry goods store 2 summers ago, and she didn't trust herself to take them down without breaking completely. By 9:45, she was standing on the porch with 2 battered traveling cases and the wooden box tucked under one arm. Doyle was already back waiting by the fence with Peters and a third man she didn't recognize, a thick-necked fellow with a hammer in his belt. They watched her come down the porch steps without speaking. She walked past them. She didn't look back. The main road through Haller Creek was a 1/4 mile from the house, and by the time Clara reached it, the wind had picked up and the temperature had dropped to somewhere well below anything reasonable. She could see the dark shelf of clouds building to the northwest, the kind of sky that people in Wyoming learn to read young and respect completely. By nightfall, maybe sooner, that sky was going to open up. She stopped at the edge of the road. She had $2 more than 12. She had the clothes on her back, a spare dress and a wool coat in one of the cases, her sewing things, Thomas's Bible. She had no family within 300 miles. Her mother had died the previous spring. Her one sister had married a farmer in Ohio, and they hadn't written in 2 years. She had 6 acquaintances in Haller Creek and 3 people she might cautiously call friends, and she stood there on that frozen road, doing the arithmetic in her head with the calm precision of a woman who understood that panic was a luxury she could not presently afford. Mrs. Elsa Grandy ran the boarding house on Sutter Street, and she was a decent woman. The room cost $1.50 a week. Clara could last 8 weeks, maybe 9 if she was careful, before the money ran out entirely. She could look for work, laundry, sewing, cooking for someone. She was good at all 3. She was strong, she was capable, and she had survived harder seasons than this, or at least she told herself so. She picked up her cases and started walking toward town. She had gone perhaps 200 yards when she heard a wagon behind her and stepped to the side of the road without turning. The wagon slowed. She kept walking. "Mrs. Whitmore?" She recognized the voice before she turned Reverend Alt from the First Methodist on Cedar Street. He was a small man, round-faced, perpetually cold-looking, and he peered down at her from the wagon seat with an expression of helpless sympathy. "Reverend," she said, "can I—" He stopped, started again. "I heard about this morning, about the eviction. I want you to know, Clara, that the congregation's several members have spoken about organizing some kind of—" "I'm fine, Reverend. You're standing on a frozen road in December with a storm coming." "I know where I'm standing." He was quiet for a moment. A good man, she thought. A man genuinely pained by what he was witnessing and genuinely uncertain what to do about it. "There's a room at the church," he said. "Not much, just the storeroom off the vestibule, but it's warm and you could— Does the church have any pull with the Central Wyoming Railroad?" He blinked. "What? Does the congregation have any legal standing? Any ability to challenge a fraudulent eviction? Any connections to anyone in Cheyenne who could compel an inquiry into my husband's death?" "Clara? Then thank you, Reverend. I'll manage." She walked on. In town it was worse somehow. Not because anyone was cruel. Most people weren't, not openly, but because of the particular quality of the silence that followed her down Main Street. She could feel eyes tracking her from inside the hardware store, from the window of the milliner's, from the barber shop where 2 men leaned in their chairs and watched her pass with the detached curiosity of people watching weather move through. A woman she'd known for 4 years, a woman named Mrs. Phelps, whose children Clara had once helped nurse through a bad fever, pressed her lips together and looked away. Nobody stopped her. Nobody said a word. She went to the boarding house first. Elsa Grandy came to the door herself, a broad, flowery woman with tired eyes who had always been kind to Clara in the offhand way of a person too busy to manage anything more elaborate than basic decency. "Clara," Elsa said. Lord, come in out of that wind. I need a room, Clara said. I can pay a week in advance. Elsa's expression shifted in a way Clara caught immediately. A fractional tightening around the eyes, something passing through them that wasn't quite pity and wasn't quite discomfort, but lived somewhere in that neighborhood. Clara, She stepped out onto the porch and pulled the door nearly shut behind her, which told Clara everything she needed to know. I already have a full house just now, 4 guests, and I've got my sister-in-law coming up from Laramie next week. You have 6 rooms, Elsa. I know, but I've been in this town for 6 years. I know how many rooms you have. Elsa looked at her with something genuine and painful in her face. Doyle came by this morning, before he went out to your place. He came by here first. She said it barely above a whisper, like she was confessing something. He said the company wouldn't be looking too kindly on businesses that he used the phrase, complicate the situation. His words, I've got a mortgage, Clara. I've got children. Clara looked at her for a long moment. Then she picked up her cases. I understand, she said. Thank you for telling me the truth at least. She tried the hotel. The man at the desk told her without meeting her eyes that they were fully booked. She tried the dry goods owner, Mr. Hester, who had always liked Thomas and treated her fairly. He came out from behind his counter, looking genuinely anguished, and told her his wife's opinion of the matter made it complicated. His wife being the kind of woman whose opinion of complicated matters tended to involve the railroad company's general store account. By 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the clouds had moved in fully, and the temperature had dropped another 10 degrees, and Clara Whitmore was standing at the north end of Main Street with both her cases on the frozen ground beside her, and nowhere left to go. She was not going to cry. She repeated that to herself with the steadiness of a woman laying down a law she intended to keep. She was not going to cry on this street in front of these people who had watched and said nothing and looked away. She was going to think. She was 32 years old. She had both her hands and her health and $12.40 and a brain that had gotten her through harder things. She almost believed that. She was trying to believe it. She was standing very still in the wind, working through the remaining options, with rigid determination when the sound of a horse stopped behind her. She didn't turn around immediately. She was tired of turning around. Ma'am. The voice was low. Not particularly loud, but with a quality to it that cut through the wind, without effort, the voice of a person accustomed to being heard the first time, not through volume, but through some quality of plainness and certainty that didn't leave much room for ignoring. She turned. The man on the horse was perhaps 40, lean in the way of a man who worked hard outdoors, and had done so for a long time, dark-eyed under the brim of a dark brown hat, pulled low against the wind. He sat his horse the way some men stand in a room with the kind of self-contained stillness that took up more space than it should. She'd seen him before, once or twice at the feed store, once at the edge of a crowd during a town meeting. She'd heard his name, Elias Boone. She'd heard other things too. I don't need help, she said. You've got 2 cases on the ground in December, he said. Storms coming in tonight, maybe sooner. I'm not seeing a horse or a wagon. I'm aware of my situation, Mr. Boone. If he was surprised she knew his name, it didn't show. He sat there looking at her with those dark, steady eyes and said nothing for a moment, which was somehow worse than if he'd argued. I'm not taking charity, she said. Not harshly, just clearly. I know. I don't know you. I know that too. People in this town say things about you. Something shifted in his jaw, not quite a reaction, more like the acknowledgement of a fact he'd long since stopped bothering to dispute. People in this town say things about everybody, he said. They said your husband knew something about the railroad's books that got him killed, and nobody in this street did a damn thing about it, including me. So I reckon we've both got cause to be skeptical of what people say. She went very still. He reached up and adjusted the brim of his hat against a gust of wind. I've got a ranch 7 miles east. House has empty rooms, nobody in them. You'd have your own space and your privacy, and you wouldn't owe me anything beyond keeping yourself alive and not freezing on this road. He paused. I'm not asking anything else of you. I want to be plain about that. Clara looked at him for a long time. She was not a foolish woman. She understood the possible dangers of the proposition he was laying out. She understood what people would say, what was already being said the moment she stood there considering it, what they would say tomorrow and the day after. She had Thomas's ring in the box under her arm, and Thomas's voice in her memory saying, "You're the most stubborn person I've ever loved," and she understood with perfect clarity that she was out of options. "I'll work," she said. "Cooking, cleaning, whatever's needed. I'm not a guest." "Didn't say you were." "And I'll leave in the spring, as soon as the roads are passable." "That's your choice to make." She picked up her cases. "If you try anything," she began. "I won't," he said. Flat and simple, like a man stating the temperature. She looked at him one more time, this quiet, weathered man, sitting still on his horse in the December wind, while every other person in Haller Creek had managed to be somewhere else when she needed them, and she made the only decision she had left. She nodded. He swung down from the horse and took both her cases without asking permission, secured them behind the saddle, and offered her a hand up with the unremarkable efficiency of a man performing a practical task. His hands were rough and cold, and he let go the moment she was settled. As they rode out of town, Clara did not look back. The wind had picked up to a real howl by the time they cleared the last buildings, and the sky to the northwest had gone the color of a bruise spreading under skin. She pulled her coat tighter and held onto the saddle and kept her spine straight and her chin level, because this was the only thing left she could control, the way she carried herself, the way she refused to be seen breaking, and she intended to control it fully. "What did you mean," she said after they'd ridden a mile in silence, "when you said my husband knew something about the railroad's books?" Elias was quiet for a moment. Not the silence of a man avoiding a question, but the silence of a man measuring how much truth to offer before he knew the ground between them. "I'll tell you when we're inside and out of this wind," he said. She wanted to push. She didn't. There was something in the steadiness of him that told her, not reassured her exactly because she wasn't ready to be reassured by anyone, but told her that whatever he knew, he would tell her. Not all of it immediately, maybe, but he would tell her. The ranch appeared out of the gray as they came down into the valley, a large solid house, dark timber and stone, with a wide porch running the length of the front, and beyond it, a barn, and several outbuildings, all of it standing against the coming storm, with the immovable patience of something built by someone who intended it to last. The lights were on inside. Only one in a front window, but it burned steady and yellow against the darkening afternoon, and Clara Whitmore, who had not cried once since she walked off her porch that morning, felt something tighten dangerously in her chest at the sight of it. She pressed her lips together and breathed through her nose and looked away at the tree line. Elias helped her down from the horse and carried her cases up the porch steps without comment. He pushed the front door open and stood aside to let her in first. The house was warm. Wood stove going in the front room, the smell of coffee and pine and lantern oil, the specific quality of warmth that a house holds when it's been lived in a long time by someone who keeps their fires burning. But it was very, very quiet. Clara stepped inside and stood in the entryway, her cases at her feet, and felt the silence of the place settle around her, not the empty silence of abandonment, but something more complicated than that. The silence of a house that had once been full and was now not, and knew the difference. "Room at the top of the stairs," Elias said, setting her cases by the door. "Bolt on the inside. Wood for the stove in the hall closet." He paused. "Coffee's hot if you want it." She turned to look at him. Standing in his own entryway, hat in hand, now looking at her with those dark, composed eyes that gave away remarkably little, and yet somehow gave away enough for her to read that this was not a comfortable moment for him either. That bringing her here had cost him something she didn't yet understand, that there were locked rooms in this man, the same way there were apparently locked rooms in this house, and that she had arrived uninvited into all of them. "The thing about my husband," she said. "You'll tell me tonight." "I'll tell you tonight," he said. She picked up her cases and went upstairs. And outside, the first real snow of the season began to fall. The bolt slid home with a sound that was more comfort than it had any right to be. Clara set her cases against the wall and stood in the middle of the small room and breathed. The walls were plain whitewashed timber, the bed frame, iron, the mattress covered with a quilt in a pattern she didn't recognize. Double wedding ring. Someone's patient work, worn soft from years of use. There was a stove in the corner with a good bed of coals already banked inside it, and a single window that looked out toward the north. And through it, she could see the snow coming down now in earnest, thick and steady and indifferent. She didn't unpack. She wasn't ready to unpack. Unpacking would mean deciding she was staying, and she wasn't ready to decide that either. She sat on the edge of the bed and held Thomas's wooden box in her lap and pressed her palms flat against the lid and just breathed. 6 years of marriage. 6 years of that particular smell, wood smoke and horses and the specific soap he used. And now she was sitting in a strange man's house 7 miles from nowhere, with a blizzard closing in, and the only thing she knew for certain was that somewhere in this house, that strange man had information about why Thomas was dead. She stood up, smoothed her dress, went downstairs. Elias was at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a folded piece of paper in front of him, and he looked up when she came in without surprise, as if he'd known exactly when she would appear. He started to rise from his chair, the automatic courtesy of a man raised to stand for women, even women he didn't know, even in his own kitchen. "Sit down," Clara said not unkindly. "You don't need to do that." He sat. She pulled out the chair across from him and sat down herself and folded her hands on the table and looked at him directly. "Tell me what you know about my husband." He looked at the folded paper. Then he unfolded it and pushed it across the table toward her. It was a letter, dated November the 3rd, 6 weeks ago, 4 weeks before Thomas died. The handwriting was Thomas's. She would have known it in the dark. Her breath left her. "Mr. Boone, I know we don't have a personal acquaintance, but I've been told you're a man who was done wrong by the Central Wyoming Railroad and lived to walk away from it. I am in a situation I need help getting out of. I have documents, numbers that don't match. I don't know who to trust in this town, and I'm running out of time to decide. If you're willing to hear me out, I'll come to you. If not, I understand. Thomas Whitmore." Clara read it twice. Then, she set it back on the table with both hands very carefully, the way you handle something that might break. "He wrote to you," she said. "He did." "And did you write back?" Elias picked up his coffee cup, set it down without drinking. "I sent word through Ben Hartley at the livery. Told him I'd hear what he had to say. Told him to come out the following Sunday." He stopped. "He didn't come." "He was dead by then." "Yes." The words sat between them like a stone dropped into still water. "He found something," Clara said. It wasn't a question. She was thinking back the last weeks of Thomas's life, the way he came home quiet, the way he locked the back door at night when he never used to bother, the way he'd said to her once about 2 weeks before the accident, "Clara, if anything ever happens to me, don't trust the company's version of it." She had told him to stop talking that way. She had told him he was frightening her. She wished now with a physical force that nearly bent her double, that she had asked him more. "What did he find?" she said. "The railroad's been running 2 sets of books for the Holler Creek operation for at least 3 years, Elias said. His voice was level and quiet, the voice of a man who'd had this information living inside him for some time, and had learned to carry it without flinching. Payroll money coming in, payroll money going out, but the numbers at the far end don't match. Workers getting paid less than what's being logged. The surplus going somewhere. Thomas worked close enough to the foreman's office to notice the discrepancy, and he was honest enough to start writing it down. He had documents. He said so in his letter. I never saw them. Clara pressed her fingers against her mouth for a moment. "They killed him," she said. "They killed him because he was keeping records." Elias didn't answer immediately. That was its own kind of answer. "Elias." She said his name for the first time, and he looked at her with something that shifted behind his eyes. "Tell me everything you know. Not part of it, all of it." He was quiet for a long breath. Then he said, I used to work for Central Wyoming, security, 4 years before I bought this ranch. I left because I started seeing things I couldn't document and couldn't report without getting buried. He turned the coffee cup in his hands. The man running the payroll operation is a man named Garrett Langford. He's also on the town council, which is how he keeps it buried. He's been doing this for at least 6 years, maybe longer. The workers who complain disappear. Not always violently. Sometimes it's just a sudden firing, a credit pulled a landlord who suddenly needs the house back. Pressure. The kind of pressure that's legal enough to defend and brutal enough to destroy a man's life. Clara thought about Elsa Grandi at the boarding house door Doyle's visit that morning, the way the word complicate had been used like a weapon. Pressure. Yes. She understood pressure now in a way she hadn't that morning. Your husband wasn't the first person to find those numbers, Elias said. He was the third. The first was a clerk named Purvis, who was fired and run out of Wyoming in the winter of '88. The second was my younger brother Daniel. The air in the kitchen changed. Daniel worked the same line as your husband. He was 24 years old. Elias's voice didn't change in temperature, but something in his jaw tightened and didn't release. He brought what he had to me. I told him to get out of town, get to Cheyenne, take the documents to the federal land office. He left on a Tuesday morning. His horse came back alone on Wednesday night. He picked up his coffee, set it down. They ruled it an accident. Horse spooked rider, thrown head injury. I knew better. I couldn't prove it. Clara looked at him for a long time. This was the man the town feared. This was the man with the rifle at the windows and the locked rooms and the silence that people had invented dark stories to explain. Because a man that quiet and that still made people nervous, people filled silence with whatever frightened them most. She looked at him and saw something else entirely. She saw a man who had been sitting 7 miles outside of Haller Creek for years, carrying the weight of his brother's murder and the evidence of a crime he couldn't prove, and waiting. For what she didn't know yet, but waiting. Daniel's things, she said slowly. The documents he had. What happened to them? Some of them are in this house, Elias said. The room at the end of the upstairs hall. The locked one. He looked at her. You noticed. I notice things, Clara said. Thomas said that about me. Said it like it was occasionally inconvenient. Her voice caught just slightly on his name, and she pressed on, without acknowledging it. If you've had documentation for 3 years, why haven't you gone to Cheyenne yourself? Why haven't you taken it to the federal office? I tried. Something crossed his face. Brief, controlled, but she caught it. 2 years ago, got as far as the hearing stage. Documents went missing from the federal clerk's office overnight. The agent assigned to the case was transferred to Montana 6 days later. Langford has reached Mrs. Whitmore. More than it should be possible for one man to have. Clara stood up from the table. She walked to the kitchen window and stood with her back to him, looking at the snow in the dark. She was trying to organize the pieces into something she could hold still long enough to examine. Thomas, writing a letter to a man he'd never met because he was out of options. Thomas keeping records in secret, lying awake at night, locking the back door. Thomas going down into that mine shaft for the last time on a rope that 3 years of reports had said needed replacing. The documents Thomas said he had, she said, still facing the window. He would have kept them somewhere I could find them. He would have made sure of that. He wasn't the kind of man who left things unfinished. She turned around. I need to go back to that house. It's a blizzard outside. I know what it is outside. I need to go back to that house before Doyle and his people tear it apart, looking for whatever Thomas hid. Clara! He used her name without seeming to notice he'd done it, and she noticed. Doyle's people were already at that house this afternoon, 2 hours after you left. I had a man in town who sent word. The coldness that moved through her had nothing to do with the weather. They searched it. Then whatever Thomas hid may still be there, Elias said. If he hid it well enough. Thomas was careful. His letter told me that much about him. A careful man who knows someone's watching him doesn't keep important things in obvious places. She came back to the table and sat down and looked at Elias Boone, this scarred, quiet man who had known her husband existed only 6 weeks ago and who had nonetheless kept his letter and sent back a message offering to help, and had shown up on that frozen road today in a way that no one else in Haller Creek had managed. She was not ready to trust him. Trust was a thing that had to be earned in increments, and she had known him for approximately 4 hours. But she needed him. That was different from trust. That was mathematics. "If the road's clear enough," she said, "I want to go back to that house." "Give it 2 days," he said. "Storm will break by Thursday." Thursday. She accepted that. "In the meantime, I want to see what Daniel had. The documents in the locked room." He looked at her steadily. Then he reached into his shirt pocket and set a small key on the table between them. She picked it up. Something passed between them then. Not warmth, not yet, not anything as simple as that, but a recognition. The kind that happens between two people who have been holding the same heavy thing alone for a long time and suddenly find themselves at the same table. She went to bed that night with the key and Thomas's Bible, and her mind running like a wheel that had forgotten how to stop. She heard Elias move through the house below the particular pattern of a man who didn't sleep well, who checked the windows and the doors with the regularity of long practice. She heard him stop at the bottom of the stairs once for just a moment and then move on. She was still awake at 2 a.m. when she heard the horse. Not Elias's horse in the barn. A different one coming fast up the road from the south, too fast for the conditions, the hoofbeats irregular in the way of a horse being pushed harder than was wise in deep snow. She was out of bed and at the window before the sound fully registered. A rider, one man, coming straight for the ranch house with the urgency of someone carrying bad news. She heard Elias's boots hit the floor below and the front door open before the rider had even reached the gate. She pulled her coat over her nightgown and went to the top of the stairs and listened. Boone. The rider's voice was breathless, ragged with cold. "There's a man. Doyle sent someone. I don't know who, but they were asking in town tonight about the widow, about whether she came out here." A pause. Elias's voice very quiet. "Who told them?" "I don't know. Maybe nobody told them anything. Maybe they figured it themselves. Boone Langford knows she's here. That's what I came to tell you. He knows." Another pause longer. "Go home, Calhoun," Elias said. "Stay out of this." "I've got a family." "I know you do. That's why I'm telling you to go home." The sound of the rider leaving, the front door closing, the particular silence of a house that has just received unwelcome news and is deciding what to do with it. Clara came down the stairs. Elias was standing in the front room with his back to her, one hand braced against the wall beside the window. He didn't startle when he heard her on the stairs. She was beginning to understand that very little startled this man. "I heard," she said. He turned to look at her. In the low lantern light, his face was stripped of whatever careful neutrality he wore by day, and what was underneath it was older and more tired and more honest. "I should have thought about this before I brought you here," he said. And there was something in his voice that wasn't quite guilt, but was close enough to it that it changed the shape of his face. "I wasn't thinking about what it would mean for you. Just that you were standing in the snow and I—" He stopped. "I should have thought it through." "You brought me in off the road," Clara said. "Langford knowing I'm here doesn't change what he already knew, that I'm Thomas's widow, and Thomas had documents. He already had reason to want to find me. You just gave me a roof over my head while he does it." He looked at her for a long moment. "You're not angry." "I'm furious," she said, perfectly calm. "But not at you. And being furious won't help me tonight." She pulled her coat tighter. "In the morning, I want to see Daniel's documents. All of them. And then I want to talk about what we're going to do next." He looked at her with those dark, steady eyes, and for just a second, the briefest fracture in that composed exterior, something that might have been relief, moved through them. "All right," he said. "In the morning." She went back to bed. She lay in the dark, listening to the snow against the window and the wind in the eaves, and somewhere below her, the quiet movements of a man keeping watch through the night. And she thought about Thomas and his careful records and his letter to a stranger, And she thought about Daniel Boone, who was 24 years old, and whose horse came home without him. And she thought about a locked room at the end of the hall, and a key she was holding in her closed hand. She thought these men have been trying to bury this for years. She thought they forgot about the women. She was at the locked door before sunrise. The key fit smooth and clean, and the room opened without protest, as if it had been waiting. Clara stepped inside and stood still for a moment, letting her eyes adjust. There was a desk along one wall, a wooden crate on the floor, and stacked across every flat surface, the desk, 2 chairs, a narrow shelf were papers. Ledgers, letters, folded documents tied with twine, the accumulated evidence of a dead man's careful, dangerous work. Daniel Boone had been thorough. Whatever else he had been thorough. She heard Elias on the stairs and didn't turn around. He stopped in the doorway. "I haven't touched any of it since the year he died," he said. "I can tell." She moved to the desk and picked up the topmost ledger, opened it. Columns of numbers, dates, names. Payroll records with discrepancies marked in a different ink, someone checking the originals against a second source circling the gaps. He knew what he was looking for. He worked the accounting office for 2 years before they moved him to the line. He knew what the numbers were supposed to look like. Clara turned a page, then another. Then she stopped. There, in the margin of a payroll sheet, dated March of 1888, in handwriting she now recognized as Daniel's, was a list of names. 5 names each with a notation beside it. 4 of the notations were dollar amounts. The 5th notation beside the name at the bottom of the list read, "Only Security Liaison, E.B." She turned slowly. Elias was already looking at it. He'd read her expression before she said a word. "E.B.," she said. "Yes. You were listed in your brother's records as the railroad's security liaison. I was, for 4 years like I told you. I left before Daniel started documenting the fraud, but I was still named in the old payroll structure. My name was in their books." He came into the room and stood beside the desk, and his voice was steady, but there was something underneath it that was not. "When Daniel found that payroll sheet, he thought for about 2 days he thought I might be part of it. He came to me. He showed me this page and asked me straight out. And what did you tell him? I told him the truth. That I'd left the railroad because I'd seen enough to know the books weren't clean, but not enough to prove it. That my name being in that ledger was a record of my old salary, not evidence of participation." He paused. He believed me, eventually. He was 24 years old, and he trusted his brother more than he trusted his own suspicions. And sometimes I think that's what got him killed. Because I told him to keep going. I told him to keep documenting. I told him it would be enough if he got enough of it together. The weight of that sentence filled the room. "You think that's your fault?" Clara said. "I know it is." She looked at him for a long moment. This man standing in his dead brother's room, among his dead brother's papers, saying those 4 words with the flat precision of someone who had said them to himself so many times that they had worn a permanent groove. She didn't tell him it wasn't his fault. That wasn't something she could honestly offer, and he would have known the difference. Instead, she turned back to the ledger. "Thomas hid what he found," she said, "before he died. He would have hidden it where I could find it. He would have left me a way to understand." She set the ledger down. "I have to go back to that house." Clara. "Elias, I have to go back." The roads were passable by Thursday morning barely, and they went on horseback because the wagon would have gotten mired before the first mile. Clara knew the house well enough to know where Thomas would have hidden something he needed to protect. Not in the furniture. Doyle's men would have torn that apart. Not in the floorboards of the main rooms, too obvious. But Thomas had spent 3 weeks one winter repointing the mortar on the fireplace in the back bedroom, a job the landlord had neglected for years, and he'd done it himself with a stubbornness that had seemed at the time like mere pride. The brick came out on the second try. Behind it, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with cord, was a packet of papers, perhaps a 1/4 inch thick. Her hands were shaking when she unwrapped it. Elias stood at the window, watching the road rifle in hand, saying nothing. She spread the papers on the floor and read fast, her eyes moving line to line with the focus of a woman running out of time. Thomas had been meticulous. More meticulous than she'd known. More meticulous, she suspected, than he'd let on to her, because he had understood that the less she knew, the safer she was. There were payroll discrepancies going back 4 years. Copies of requisition forms showing mine equipment costs approved and logged, but a separate handwritten notation in Thomas's small, careful script, cross-referencing the actual equipment against the logged expenses. The rope on the lift in Shaft 3 had been approved for replacement in January of 1891. The replacement cost had been logged and paid. The rope had never been replaced. Thomas had noted the date he confirmed this, the name of the foreman who had signed the approval, and the name of the man at the company office who had countersigned. That man's name was Garrett Langford, but it was the last page that stopped her completely. It was a single sheet folded separately from the rest. At the top, in Thomas's handwriting, "If something happens to me, this is why." Below that, a date, November the 15th, 2 weeks before his death. Below that, a name she had not expected. Deputy Sheriff Warren Cade. Thomas had written W. Cade was present at the shaft inspection in January. He signed the equipment log as witness. He knows the rope was never replaced. He has been paid quarterly since January. See payroll sheet, 7 line 14, coded as consulting fee. He is the law in Haller Creek. Do not go to him. Clara sat back on her heels. "Elias," she said. He turned from the window. She held up the last page. He crossed the room and read it standing over her, and she watched his face and saw the exact moment the name landed. His jaw tightened. His eyes went still in a particular way. "Cade," he said. "You didn't know." "No." He said it like a man checking the ground under his feet to make sure it was still solid. "I didn't know." They were back at this ranch by midday. Clara spread both sets of documents across the kitchen table and began organizing them Daniel's ledgers alongside Thomas's papers, cross-referencing dates, building the picture in full. It was larger than either of them had mapped alone. 3 years of payroll theft. Falsified equipment logs. At least 2 deaths that could now be tied by documentation and motive to deliberate negligence or worse. And at the center of it, protecting it, providing the legal cover that made it untouchable, a deputy sheriff on the company's quiet payroll. "This is enough," Clara said. She pressed both palms flat on the table. "If we can get this to a federal agent, not through Cheyenne, not through anyone. Langford has reach with, if we can get this directly to the U.S. Marshal's office in Denver." She stopped because she heard horses outside, more than one. Elias was already moving. 3 men came through the front gate with the unhurried confidence of people who had the law behind them, or believed they did. In the lead was Doyle, still wearing his railroad coat, his face set in the flat professional expression she had last seen in her kitchen 4 days ago. Behind him came 2 men she didn't know, and behind them, on a gray horse, came Deputy Warren Cade. Clara stood at the front window and watched them come. "Stay inside," Elias said. "I will not," she said, and went out the door. Doyle pulled his horse up at the porch steps and looked down at her with that practiced expression of bureaucratic regret. "Mrs. Whitmore, I need you to understand that this isn't personal." "That's the second time you've said that to me," Clara said. "It wasn't true the first time either. There are documents belonging to the Central Wyoming Railroad Company that were removed from company property. We have reason to believe some of those documents are currently on these premises." He looked past her at Elias. "Mr. Boone, I'd ask you to stand aside." "You'd ask?" Elias said. Cade moved his horse forward, and Clara looked at him. This man whose name was in Thomas's handwriting, who had witnessed and signed and cashed his quarterly fee and ridden through Haller Creek for years, wearing a badge, and felt a cold and clarifying anger move through her that burned off every other feeling like frost in morning sun. "Deputy Cade," she said. "January the 9th, 1891. Shaft 3 inspection. Equipment log witnessed and signed by you." Cade's face went very still. "The rope was never replaced," she said. "You know that. You were there. You signed the form, and then you signed Langford's payment authorization, and my husband died on that rope in December, and you rode in the funeral procession, and you are standing here right now, helping these men come for the evidence of what you did." Dead silence. Doyle looked at Cade. Something passed between them that was fast and unreadable and not good. "She's got the documents," Doyle said, and his voice had changed. The bureaucratic regret was gone, and something colder had replaced it. "Cade." What happened next happened fast. Cade reached for the rifle in his saddle scabbard. Elias moved off the porch in one motion, crossing the distance between them, before the rifle cleared leather, and the combination of his speed and the absolute certainty of his movement made Cade's horse sidestep hard. Cade grabbed mane to stay mounted. The rifle hit the ground. Doyle wheeled his horse. "Get the barn," he said to the two men behind him. "Burn it." "No." Clara was off the porch steps before she'd decided to move. Elias caught her arm. "The documents aren't in the barn," he said sharply. "Clara, the documents are in the house. Let them burn the barn." She understood what he meant. She understood it, and she hated it with every part of her because those were his horses and his livelihood, and he was telling her to let it go. Because the evidence was more important. Because the evidence was the only thing that could end this. And she looked at his face and saw that he had already made the calculation and made his peace with it. "We need to get to Denver," she said. "Yes." Tonight, before they regroup. Cade had gotten his horse under control and was looking at them from a distance, with an expression that had moved past professional composure into something rawer and more frightened. The expression of a man watching his careful construction begin to come apart. "Langford will hear about this within the hour," he said, and his voice had changed too. The authority was gone. What was left was something smaller. "You don't understand what you're doing." "I understand exactly what I'm doing," Clara said. "I'm finishing what my husband started." She went back inside. Behind her, she heard the barn doors crash open and the horses screaming, and she heard Elias behind her close, and she heard Cade's voice once more, lower now, almost to himself, saying something she couldn't fully make out. She didn't stop to hear it. She had the documents in her arms. She had Thomas's oilcloth packet and Daniel's tied bundles and both sets of ledgers wrapped in her spare wool coat. She had Thomas's Bible in her coat pocket and the ring around her neck on a piece of cord, because she had put it there that morning without quite knowing why, as if she understood already that today was going to require her to keep her hands free. Elias came through the door behind her, and his shirt smelled of smoke, and there was a cut across his left forearm that was bleeding quietly into his sleeve, and he did not mention it, and she did not ask about it yet, because there was not time. He went straight to the back of the house, and she heard him moving fast in the room he used as an office, and when he came back, he had a saddlebag over one shoulder. "I've got a man in Bitter Creek who can get us on the southbound line without going through the Haller Creek station," he said. "It'll take most of the night riding. Can you manage it?" "I've managed worse things this week," Clara said. Something moved through his expression, quick and complicated, not quite a smile, but in the neighborhood of one. He held the door open. She walked through it. The smoke from the barn was thick and black against the white sky, and as they came around the side of the house with the horses, Clara looked at it once. 6 years of Thomas's careful, frightened documentation. Daniel's 2 years of quiet courage. 2 dead men's lives reduced to paper that she was carrying against her chest like it was the most precious thing in Wyoming because it was. "Elias?" she said as he swung up into the saddle. He looked at her. "I'm sorry about your barn." He was quiet for a beat. "Then, I'll build another one." She mounted up. They rode south into the white, and behind them, the smoke rose black and straight in the still winter air visible from a long way off. The kind of signal that meant something had changed, and the change was permanent, and nobody in Haller Creek who looked up and saw it could pretend later that they hadn't known. They rode for 6 hours through the dark. Elias set the pace hard enough to cover ground, controlled enough to keep the horses sound on the icy roads, and Clara matched it without complaint. The cold was the kind that got into the bones and stayed there, and she rode with the documents wrapped inside her coat against her chest. One arm pressed across them, and she did not think about how cold she was, because thinking about it wouldn't help. They had been riding for perhaps 2 hours when Elias slowed suddenly and held up a hand. Clara pulled up beside him and listened. Behind them, maybe a quarter-mile back, hoofbeats. Single rider moving at a steady pace, not racing, not hiding, just following. "How long?" she said. "Since we left the South Road." "Cade's men." "Maybe." He turned his horse to face back up the road. "Stay here." "Elias." "I'll be 2 minutes." He wasn't 2 minutes. He was 4, and they were the longest 4 minutes Clara had spent since the morning Doyle walked into her kitchen. She sat her horse in the dark with the documents against her chest, and Thomas's ring pressing into her sternum through the cord, and she listened and heard nothing, and then heard hoofbeats again, 2 horses this time coming toward her. Elias came out of the dark with a second rider beside him, a lean, weather-creased man in a canvas coat who looked at Clara with the cautious assessment of someone being introduced under difficult circumstances. "This is Hicks," Elias said. "He works the Bitter Creek Freight Depot. He's been following us since Langford's men set up a watch on the South Road out of Haller Creek." Clara looked at Hicks. "There's a watch on the road. 2 men, at the junction." Hicks' voice was low and rapid. "Been there since about an hour after you left the ranch. Somebody in town sent word fast." He glanced at Elias. "I know a way around. Adds maybe 40 minutes, but it keeps you clear of them." "Take us," Clara said. Hicks took them east along a creek bed that shouldn't have been passable in December, and was barely passable now, the horses picking their way over frozen ground with the careful displeasure of animals doing something they found unreasonable. Twice, Clara's horse stumbled, and she grabbed mane and kept herself up through sheer stubbornness. The document stayed dry inside her coat. They reached Bitter Creek as the sky was beginning to pale in the east. The freight depot contact was a small man named Tully, who smelled of axle grease and asked no questions, which Clara found she appreciated more than almost anything. He had them in a freight car on the southbound Denver line before full light tucked between crates of mining equipment and a stack of lumber wrapped in canvas, and he locked the car from outside and didn't say goodbye. The train moved. Clara sat on the lumber, with her back against the wall of the car and the documents in her lap, and Elias 2 feet away, and for the first time in what felt like weeks, there was nothing immediately required of either of them. She unwrapped the oilcloth and went through Thomas's papers again, by the thin light coming through the freight car's ventilation slats. She had read them twice already, but she read them again because there was a detail nagging at her. Something she had noticed, and then not noticed, in the chaos of the afternoon before. She found it on the 3rd pass. Thomas's last notation, the one dated November the 15th. At the bottom of the page below the warning about Cade, he had written a single line she had skimmed past before. Sent word to Boone. Sunday. Will bring everything. She sat with that sentence for a moment. "He sent you another message," she said, "after the letter in November. He sent word that he was coming to you on Sunday, the Sunday he died." Elias had his eyes closed, but he wasn't sleeping. He opened them now and looked at her. "I know," he said quietly. The freight car swayed. "Someone intercepted it," Clara said. "Someone in the railroad office knew Thomas was going to you. That's why the rope failed that week, and not another week. They moved up the timeline." She said it aloud, not because she needed Elias to confirm it, but because she needed to hear it in her own voice, the full shape of it. They murdered him specifically, not just negligence, not just the rope that needed replacing. Someone made a decision. "Yes," Elias said. "And the signed order on the equipment log, Langford's signature, that's the proof." "That's the proof." She folded the paper back into the oilcloth and tied the cord. Her hands were steady. She noticed that and thought Thomas always said she was the calmer one in a crisis. He was the one who felt everything immediately and fiercely, who cried at broken things, who brought injured animals home. She was the one who went quiet and precise when the situation demanded it. She had always thought that was a flaw in herself. some absence of sufficient feeling. She understood now it was the opposite. It was the deepest feeling she had channeled into the only form that could be useful. "I'm going to make sure they pay for this," she said. Not loudly, not with drama. Just as a statement of fact, the way you state the temperature or the distance to the next town. Elias looked at her for a long moment. "I know," he said. The U.S. Marshal's field office in Denver occupied the second floor of a federal building on Larimer Street, and the agent who received them, a compact, skeptical man named Aldridge with reading glasses, pushed up on his forehead, looked at Clara and Elias with the politely restrained doubt of a man who had seen a great many people walk through his door carrying stories about railroad corruption and was not on the whole easily impressed. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said after she had laid the first set of documents on his desk, "I appreciate you coming in. Before we go further, I'd like to understand your relationship to the Central Wyoming Railroad." "My husband died on their equipment," Clara said. "He was documenting their fraud before they killed him. I have his records and the records of another man they killed 3 years ago, and a signed equipment authorization that proves deliberate negligence at the executive level." She set Thomas's last page in front of him. "I'd like you to look at that name." Aldridge picked it up. He read it. He set it down, and something in his careful, professional face shifted in a way he probably didn't intend Clara to notice. She noticed. "Garrett Langford," he said. "You know the name." He looked at her over his reading glasses for a moment. Then he got up from his desk and went to the door and opened it. "Morrison," he called. "Come in here." A second man entered, younger than Aldridge, with a leather satchel under one arm, and the alert, slightly wound-up energy of someone deep in the middle of something. He looked at the documents on the desk, and then at Clara, and his expression did something unexpected. "Where did you get these?" he said. "From a fireplace," Clara said, "where my husband hid them before he was killed." Morrison sat down without being invited to, and picked up the payroll ledger from Daniel's papers and opened it to the middle, and Clara watched his face as he read, and she saw recognition in it. Not the slow recognition of a man encountering new information. The quick recognition of a man finding a piece he has been looking for. "We've been building a case against the Central Wyoming Railroad since the spring," Aldridge said. He was watching her with a different quality of attention now. "Federal land grant fraud. Primarily, the company's been claiming land improvements that don't exist in order to maintain their federal subsidy. We have documentation going back 2 years. He paused. "What we haven't been able to establish is the internal mechanism, how the money moves, who authorizes it, who signs off at the local level." He looked at the page with Langford's signature. "This is the local level." Clara looked at Elias. Elias looked at the wall behind Aldridge's head with the expression of a man who has been carrying a stone uphill for a long time and has just seen the top. "Cade," Elias said. "The deputy in Howler Creek. He's on the payroll. Consulting fees. It's in Thomas Whitmore's records." Morrison was already writing. What followed was 3 hours of the most focused conversation Clara had experienced in her life. Organized, methodical, every document cataloged and dated, and cross-referenced against what the federal office already had. Aldridge asked sharp questions, and she answered them precisely. And when she didn't know something, she said so. And when she knew something, she said that with equal precision, and at some point, she became aware that both men had stopped treating her like a witness and started treating her like a colleague, which was the first time that had happened to her in any official context in her 32 years on Earth. By the time they walked out of the building onto Larimer Street, warrants had been authorized for Garrett Langford, Warren Cade, and 3 additional named individuals in the railroad's corporate structure. The wheels of the federal apparatus, once set in motion, moved with a speed and thoroughness that had nothing personal in it, and was all the more effective for that. Langford was arrested at his office in Howler Creek on a Tuesday afternoon, 2 days after Clara and Elias returned home. She heard about it from Elsa Grandy, who appeared at the ranch gate that morning, looking like a woman who had not slept well and had something she needed to say. "Clara." Elsa stood at the gate with her hands clasped in front of her. "I know I have no right to ask anything of you. I know what I did, what I didn't do when you came to my door. I need you to understand that I'm sorry. I am genuinely, deeply sorry, and I know that doesn't repair anything." Clara looked at her from the porch. "No," she said. "It doesn't." "I know." They stood there with that between them for a moment, two women, and the particular weight of what one had done to the other when the cost of decency became too high. "Is there something you needed?" Clara said. Not harshly, just the question. Elsa pressed her lips together. "Word in town is that you and Mr. Boone are the ones who brought the federal office in, that it was your documents that got Langford arrested." She paused. Some people are saying they should have done more. When you were on that street, when you needed a room." "Some people," Clara said. "More than some." Clara looked at her. At the genuine anguish in her face, which was real, and which Clara did not doubt, and which nonetheless existed here on this porch today, and not on that street 4 days ago, when it might have actually mattered. People were remarkably good at feeling things once the danger was past. She had learned that this week in ways she would not forget. "Tell them," Clara said finally, "that if anyone in Haller Creek has information about Thomas Whitmore's death, or Daniel Boone's death, or the railroad's operations, that they haven't come forward with the time to come forward is now. The federal office has a contact in Cheyenne. That's the useful thing people can do." She held Elsa's gaze. "Beyond that, I don't need apologies. I need witnesses." Elsa nodded. She looked like she might say more, then didn't. She turned and walked back down the gate road, and Clara watched her go. Behind her, the sound of a hammer. She turned. Elias was in the frame of what had been the barn, working in the cold morning air with the steady, deliberate rhythm of a man who understood that grief was not a reason to stop building. 3 men from the south end of the valley, men she didn't know. Men Elias apparently did, had shown up that morning with timber and tools and had simply started working alongside him without needing to be asked or organized or thanked. She watched him for a moment. The set of his shoulders, the economy of his movement, the way he stopped once and looked out over the valley, with an expression she was beginning to learn, that particular stillness, that meant he was feeling something he wasn't going to mention unless she asked. She went and got her coat and crossed the yard and picked up a hammer. He looked at her. "I can hold boards," she said. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to." She held out her free hand for a board. "Give me something useful to do." He handed her a board without further argument. They worked in silence for a while, the kind of silence that had a different quality than the silences of earlier in the week. Those silences had been the silences of 2 strangers being careful with each other. This one was something else. The silence of 2 people who had ridden through the dark together and sat in a freight car together and laid evidence on a federal agent's desk together and had somewhere in the process become something that didn't have a name yet but was real. "Cade gave a full statement this morning," Elias said between strokes. "Aldridge sent word. He named everyone. Langford, the company director's a judge in Laramie who's been suppressing complaints for 4 years. He paused. He named the foreman who gave the order on the rope. Clara held the board steady. "Is that enough?" "It's more than enough." She was quiet for a moment. "Thomas would have been glad," she said. Not sadly, just truthfully. He was the kind of man who cared whether things were made right. He wouldn't have needed to see it himself. He just would have needed to know it happened. The hammer came down. The board held. "He sounds like a good man," Elias said. He was. She looked at the raw timber of the new wall going up. So was Daniel. Elias didn't answer. He didn't need to. She felt it in the way he brought the hammer down on the next nail. Something released in it, some fraction of the weight he'd been carrying, set down on the ground between them and left there. By late afternoon, the south wall of the new barn was framed and standing, and the 3 men from the valley had gone home, and Clara was sitting on an overturned crate with her coat around her shoulders, and her hands sore, and a tiredness in her body that was the clean, honest tiredness of work, rather than the grinding exhaustion of grief. Elias came and sat on the fence rail near her, not close but near. He had a cut on his right hand he hadn't mentioned, and she looked at it without commenting, and then looked away. "What will you do?" he said. "When this is settled?" She thought about that. She had been so focused on the mechanics of getting through each day, The eviction, the documents, the train, the federal office, the return that the question of after had stayed somewhere in the peripheral distance, not quite real yet. "I don't know," she said. "I had a life that was one thing. Now I'll have to build one that's something else." She looked at her sore hands. "I'm capable of it." "I know you are," he said. No qualification, no hesitation. She looked at him. He was looking out at the valley, that steady, composed profile against the winter sky, and she thought about the man who had left a blanket outside his dead brother's room for 3 years without ever going in. The man who had sent a message to a stranger because it was the right thing to do. The man who had held his horse still in the December wind while every other person in Haller Creek managed to be somewhere else. "Elias," she said. He looked at her. "Thank you," she said, "for stopping." He was quiet for a long beat. Then, "Somebody had to." "They didn't, though," she said. "That's the thing. Nobody had to. Plenty of people didn't." She held his gaze. "You did." Something moved through his face past the composed exterior, past the habitual stillness all the way down to something real and unguarded and briefly visible. He looked away first. "This ranch has work that needs doing," he said after a moment. "More than one person can manage. The spring cattle run alone." He stopped, started differently. "I'm not asking anything of you, Clara. I want to be plain about that. I'm just saying that if you needed time to decide what comes next, there's no reason to decide it from somewhere else." She looked at the framed wall of the new barn standing clean against the sky. She thought about empty rooms, about a house that had known grief for a long time and had gotten quiet with it, about the particular kind of loneliness that didn't announce itself, but lived in the locked doors and the unlit rooms, and the way a man sat alone at a kitchen table with a letter from a stranger and sent back a message that said, "I'll hear what you have to say." She didn't answer him yet, but she didn't say no. She told him the next morning. He was at the stove when she came downstairs doing what she had learned he did every morning without variation: coffee first, then whatever needed doing in that order. And she came into the kitchen and sat down at the table and folded her hands in front of her and said, "I'll stay through the spring if the offer still stands." He poured a second cup of coffee and set it in front of her without turning around. "It stands." "I'll work," she said. "I'm not a guest. I want that understood." "Already understood." "And I'll need to go to Cheyenne when the trial date is set, to testify." "I'll go with you." She wrapped both hands around the cup. "All right then." He sat down across from her, and they drank their coffee in the quiet morning, and that was how it was decided. Not with ceremony, not with anything that could be called a speech. Just two people at a table reaching an agreement that had the plain, durable quality of something built to last. The weeks that followed had their own rhythm. The ranch work was real and constant, and required all of both of them. The cattle that had been underattended through the worst of winter, the fencing that had come down in the storms, the equipment that needed repair, the 1,000 details of a working property that had been managed by one person alone for too long. Clara learned things she had never had occasion to learn. She learned how to read ice on a water trough, how to tell a sick animal from a tired one, how to stretch wire tight enough to hold without snapping. Her hands, already rough from years of housework, became different, stronger, more knowing. Elias was a patient teacher who never explained twice what she had already understood, and never made her feel the lack of what she didn't yet know. He worked beside her rather than in front of her, which she came to understand was not a small thing. In February, a letter arrived from Morrison at the federal office in Denver. The warrants had been executed. Langford was in federal custody. Cade had been stripped of his badge and was cooperating fully with the prosecution in exchange for a reduced charge. 2 of the railroad's corporate directors had fled to Kansas, where they were subsequently apprehended. The Central Wyoming Railroad's federal land subsidy had been suspended pending a full audit that Morrison indicated would likely result in the company's dissolution. Clara read the letter standing at the kitchen window and then folded it and held it against her chest for a moment. "It's done," she said. Elias was at the table. He didn't say anything. He just looked at her with those steady dark eyes that she had learned over these weeks to read more accurately than she had at the beginning. He was glad. He was relieved. He was something else underneath both of those things, something older and more private, and she understood it was grief for Daniel, for Thomas, for all the years he had been sitting with this and unable to move it. She sat down across from him and put the letter on the table between them. "They're going to want us in Cheyenne," she said. "Both of us. For the trial." "I know. Are you ready for that?" He thought about it honestly, which was one of the things she had come to value about him. He did not say things he didn't mean in order to seem steady. "I'll be ready," he said. "I need to be ready." The trial date was set for the second week of March. They rode to Cheyenne on a Wednesday, checked into separate rooms at a boarding house on Capitol Avenue, and appeared at the federal courthouse the following morning. Clara wore the good dress she had brought in her case from Howler Creek, the dark blue wool one, clean and pressed. And she walked into that courtroom and sat in the witness chair and answered every question Aldridge's prosecutor put to her with the same quiet precision she had brought to the federal office in Denver 2 months before. She described Thomas's letter to Elias. She described finding the documents in the fireplace. She described Doyle's visit, and Cade reaching for his rifle, and the barn burning. She described her husband's last notation, sent word to Boone. Sunday. "We'll bring everything," and she said it without her voice breaking, which cost her more than anything she had done in that building, and she did it because Thomas had been careful, and she was going to be careful for him. Langford's attorney tried to discredit her. He used words like grieving widow and emotionally compromised, and acting under the influence of an interested party, that last phrase directed at Elias, who was sitting in the gallery and whose face did not change by a single muscle while it was said. Clara waited until the attorney finished, and then she said evenly, "Every document I presented was dated and in my husband's handwriting verified by the Federal Forensics Office. Which of those documents would you like to discuss specifically?" The attorney did not take her up on the offer. When Elias testified, he was on the stand for 2 hours. He described Daniel's death in a voice so controlled it had no quality to it at all except truth, and somehow that was more devastating than if he had wept. The jury, Clara noticed, leaned forward when he spoke. Langford was convicted on 11 counts. The sentencing hearing was set for April. Clara sat in the courthouse corridor afterward, with her hands in her lap and her eyes on the middle distance, and felt something she hadn't expected. Not triumph, not relief exactly, but a settling. Like a house that has been standing at a slight angle for years, finally finding its true foundation. Elias sat down beside her. "Daniel would have been satisfied," he said. "Thomas too." She looked at him. "Are you?" He thought about that for a long moment. "Not yet," he said, "but I think I might be able to get there." She nodded. That was honest. That was enough. They rode back to Howler Creek in the first week of April, when the mud was deep and the air smelled of snowmelt and wet earth, and the particular sharp green of things that had been under snow for months and were now cautiously beginning to try again. Clara noticed the valley differently that day, the way the light came off the hills, the width of the sky, the solidity of the mountains to the west. She had arrived here in December in the dark in a blizzard on a horse she didn't own, with $12.40 and nowhere to go. She rode back in spring with the case she had built alongside the man beside her, settled into federal record, and she felt the difference in her spine. The town had changed. Not uniformly human nature didn't work that way, but enough to see. Several people who had looked away from her on Main Street in December now met her eyes. A few of them nodded. Mrs. Phelps, whose children Clara had once helped nurse through a fever, stopped her outside the dry goods store and pressed her hand without words, and Clara let her, because the gesture was genuine, even if it came late. What mattered more was what happened at the ranch. In May, a woman appeared at the gate with a suitcase and a bruise along her jaw, and 2 weeks' worth of exhaustion in her eyes. She had come from Rollins, she said. She'd heard that the woman at the Boone Ranch sometimes helped people who needed it. Clara looked at her for a moment. Then she opened the gate. She put the woman in the room at the top of the stairs. The room she had first slept in herself, and made sure there was wood in the stove and food on the table, and in the morning she sat with her at the kitchen table, and they talked about what the woman needed, and what the practical options were, and what the next step might look like. Elias said nothing about it except to ask whether the woman needed anything from town. The summer brought others. Not many, 5, 6, 7 men and women, both people who had run out of other options and had heard through the particular network of the desperate that spans every community and is invisible until you need it, that the lantern at the Boone Ranch meant the door was open. Clara organized what she could. She knew which women needed legal help and which needed practical help and which needed only to sit somewhere warm and quiet for a few days before they could face the road again. She learned that these were often the same women and that the distinctions between the categories were less useful than simply paying attention to what was in front of her. One evening in late July, Elias came and stood in the doorway of the room she used as a small office, Thomas's wooden box on the desk, her correspondence organized in neat stacks, a ledger she kept for the household accounts open in front of her, and he stood there for a moment without speaking. "What?" she said without looking up. "Nothing, bae," he said. "Just looking." She looked up then. He was leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed and his hat off, and there was an expression on his face she didn't see often. Open in a way he usually wasn't, unguarded in the specific way of someone who has forgotten for a moment to maintain the careful exterior they've been maintaining for years. "You're thinking about Daniel again," she said. "I'm thinking about how he would have liked you," Elias said. "He was a good judge of people. He would have trusted you in about 4 minutes. A pause. "Which is 3.5 minutes faster than I managed." She smiled. She couldn't help it. "You were cautious." "I was terrified," he said. Then, as if surprised to hear himself say it, "First time someone needed help on that road and I stopped. Every other time I kept riding. I don't know what was different about that morning." She set her pen down. "What do you mean, every other time?" He was quiet for a moment. "There were other people on that road, Clara. Other people in situations that weren't their fault. I told myself it wasn't my business, that I had enough trouble without taking on other people's." He looked at the floor. "Daniel would have stopped every time. I couldn't be Daniel. That morning you were standing there and something—" He stopped, looked up. "I couldn't keep riding." She looked at him for a long time. At this man who had been building a wall around himself for 3 years out of grief and guilt and the specific kind of loneliness that comes from knowing exactly what you should have done and not being able to undo it. She thought about what it had cost him to stop his horse on that road. Not just the practical costs, the risk, the trouble, the fire, the trial, but the interior ones. The willingness to let someone into the silence of this house after years of keeping it precisely because the silence was safer. "You couldn't keep riding," she said. "That's enough." "Is it?" "Yes," she said. "Because here we are." He nodded slowly, that deliberate nod that meant he was accepting something he wasn't entirely sure he deserved. She had learned to recognize it. She had learned to simply wait through it. September came with its particular quality of gold and sharpness, the light slanting low across the valley, the mornings cold and the afternoons warm, and the sense everywhere of a world preparing itself for winter, with no urgency, because it had done this before and knew how. Clara was on the porch one evening, finishing the last of the light with her mending, when Elias came out and sat on the step below her, and was quiet for a while, in the comfortable way they had developed for each other's silences. Then he said, "If I asked you to stay beyond the spring—" He stopped. "If I asked you to stay altogether, not as a—" He was choosing words with unusual care, which was not like him, and she set the mending in her lap and listened. "I'm not asking for anything. You're not ready to give Clara. I want to be plain about that. I have been plain about that since the beginning, and I mean it. But I need to ask the question because I think you deserve to be asked honestly instead of just waiting and hoping." She looked at the valley below the porch, the cattle moving slow and dark against the golden grass, the mountains going blue in the early dusk, the new barn standing solid and square, built with both their hands. She reached up and found the cord around her neck, the one she had put there on the morning everything fell apart, and she worked the knot loose. The ring slid off the cord and sat in her palm, Thomas's plain gold band worn smooth warm from lying against her skin for 9 months. She held it for a moment. She thought about Thomas. Not with the tearing grief of the first months, not with the guilt of someone trying to move on too soon, but with the clear and lasting love of a woman who had known a good man and lost him, and intended to honor both facts for the rest of her life. Thomas had kept records in secret to protect her. Thomas had written a letter to a stranger because he was out of options. Thomas had told her once early in their marriage, "I just want you to be all right. That's all I want. Whatever happens." She closed her hand around the ring. "You said this house had empty rooms," she said. "I did. I'd like to help fill them." She looked at him. "Properly, if you're asking." He looked at her with those dark, steady eyes that she had learned to read from the beginning of winter to the end of summer, through the locked rooms, and the night riders, and the freight car, and the courthouse, and every ordinary morning of the months between. And what was in them now was something she recognized, because she felt it herself. Not the sharp, bright thing of the early months. Something deeper and more durable. Something built of shared work and shared trouble, and the specific intimacy of two people who have seen each other at their most stripped down and are still sitting on the porch. "I'm asking," he said. She put Thomas's ring in the small inside pocket of her dress, where she would keep it, always not gone, not forgotten, but given its right place. She reached out and put her hand over Elias's, where it rested on the porch rail. He turned his hand over and held hers. The lantern at the edge of the porch was already lit the way it was every evening. Now the light visible from the road, steady and plain, legible to anyone who needed to read it. Clara had hung it there in the spring without discussing it, and Elias had trimmed the wick the following morning without asking about it, and neither of them had ever needed to say what it was for, because they both already knew. Years later, people who came through the valley would say the same thing about the Boone place, that the light outside meant the door was open, that you didn't have to be anyone in particular, or have anything in particular to deserve to knock. That the woman who answered kept food on the stove, and asked the right questions, and didn't look at you with the flat rehearsed sympathy of someone performing charity, but with the direct clear attention of someone who had once been standing in the snow herself, and understood exactly what it cost to ask for help. That the man of the house never said much, but his hands were always doing something useful, and nobody who stopped at that ranch went away without whatever they had actually needed. The Boone Ranch became known across 3 counties, not for its cattle, though the cattle were good, and not for its size, though it grew, but for the lantern. For the quality of the light it put out. For the fact that it was lit every single evening without fail in every weather, in every season. Because Clara Whitmore Boone had decided in her first spring in the valley that the world contained enough locked doors already, and she was not going to be another one. She had arrived at that gate with $12 and the clothes on her back, and nowhere left to go. She had built from that rubble something she could not have imagined on the morning Doyle walked into her kitchen and told her she had 20 minutes. Not because a good man had rescued her. She had never needed rescuing. Because a good man had stopped his horse on a frozen road and offered her a door, and she had walked through it on her own 2 feet and made it into something worth keeping. That was the whole of it. That was all the story was, and all the story needed to be. A woman who refused to stay on the ground. A man who finally stopped riding past. And between them, a light that never went out.